So I guess first of all, I'll start with today is Thanksgiving in the United States where I came from, and I'm very thankful both that I've managed to get here and also to Sharon, who put up with an email from me about once an hour saying things like, I've gotten to the airport. They sent me home and told me to come back tomorrow. I realized my test will be more than 72 hours old. I will go get another one. I'm in Germany. I hope they let me get on the connecting flight. So thank you, Sharon, for dealing with that with me. So to explain with why I want to talk to you about the next 10 years of DevOps, there's two parts of this. One is why I want to talk to you about it, and one is why 10 years. So before we get into that, just to give me a sense of who's here, since I didn't get to be here with all of you yesterday, how many of you are happiest when you're writing code? Self-identify as developers, I just want to be writing code as much as possible. It's dark, but I'd say it's like a quarter of us. And how many of us are happiest maybe when something is on fire and it's going wrong, or we're setting up a brand new system? Cool, the other half. So half of you are going to like me for this and the other half won't. But most recently, before Bold Start, I started a company called Dark. We built a programming language based on the premise of if most of what we're building is web services, does that mean our programming languages for building those should be ops included? So we just write code and don't do anything else. That looks a little bit like this. You just set up a backend endpoint, specify where it lives, the method, and it exists already. People who really like code tend to like this. People who really like setting up operations tend to think I have taken all of the fun out of their job. So I'm sorry if you're one of those people. I'm going to show a bunch of different tools as we go through this morning. And so none of them are specific recommendations. If something strikes you as cool, I'll put up a list of all of them at the end that you can just take a photo of, so you don't have to worry about it as we go through. But Dark is one of those. You can still use this. If you go to Darklang, there's a beta, and my co-founder still works on it. But today, I'm at Bold Start Ventures as a founder in residence. And so Bold Start makes seed stage investments, mostly in infrastructure-related companies, almost all technical founders. A few are here today. M0 and Replicated both have booths. Also, the team at JitDio is due here, and they're working on minimum viable security with a developer-first approach. I know they're around and would be happy to talk to people. But what I like about this is after spending a few years thinking about what do I want to build as the next 10 years of DevOps, I've gotten to talk to a lot of other smart founders and team members about what they think is coming next. And so this talk is as much about my own predictions as it is about what I've seen and learned from other people over time. Okay, so then the 10 years part. I like to think of this as it sets us in the middle of a timeline, which is, I think, where we really are in the journey of DevOps. I think of the genesis as that first DevOpsDays in 2009, or the somewhat famous John Allspaw, Paul Hammond talk from Velocity, which was also in 2009. I can do math. I know that it's 2021, but I figured since we haven't had any in-person events over the last couple of years, we could situate ourselves here and say it's the middle. And I think it's interesting how far we've come in this time. I personally didn't realize quite how far it was until I started thinking about what 2009 was actually like. iPads were new, and I personally thought they would never succeed. Google Plus had just launched, and I thought it would kill Facebook. We're learning my predictive abilities are not very good. Quickster, Netflix had just decided that they were going to go into streaming instead of mailing us all DVDs. I think they were mostly US-based at that point, and everyone was really, really, really mad about it, which I think is funny given how Netflix is now one of the premier infrastructure companies. Smartphones were still primarily made by Nokia. The word unicorn didn't exist yet. Angular was the new cool thing. No NPM. There were only like 5 WS services in the console, and you could remember them. And the big debate we were all having was if we wanted to be sysadmins or DevOps people. Personally, I thought this would also be helpful for anyone who hasn't been in the industry as long. It was pretty bad 10 years ago. I worked on software that was shipped in a box. Some of you may also remember this era. It was, you usually had a PM and a developer and a tester, and you worked very carefully on the same thing for 3 years, because if you made any mistakes, they were permanent for another 3 years. And so you spent a lot of time just trying to narrow down completely minuscule issues about what you were building. And that was why this original talk from Velocity in 2009 was so controversial. If you're accustomed to working in a world where things move exceptionally slowly, suddenly saying we have to change really quickly based on how the world is moving, change causes outages, and we need to lower that risk was a little bit controversial. And I think there were some bad times during that era where we all argued with each other, saying it was your fault, no, it's your fault. You could easily flip the cat and the salad ladies if you want. But it works out pretty well. We now all have computers in our pockets. I guess mine's technically over there. There's 71 unicorns just in Israel now, which I think is a pretty cool statistics. I can't attest to predict where any of the next line is going around metaverse based on how wrong I was about iPads and Google+. But on things I do know about, we now have Jamstack applications. We have more front-end frameworks than probably I can count. Tons and tons of packages in NPM. AWS console is now completely full-featured. And if you just take my personal career, I get to deploy about 26,000 times more often than I did 10 years ago, which is a pretty extreme metric. And so from that perspective, things are great. This is so much better than it was. Really happy. But what's most annoying today? Before I flip to my answer, maybe come up with yours in your head. There's definitely still a bunch of stuff I don't like. Smart quotes that prevent things from building is one of the banes of my existence. But I asked a bunch of my friends and Twitter, and I liked the way Maggie summed it up, where she still feels like we have to choose between fast feedback loops and runtime safety. Maggie isn't the only one who feels this way. I'd be curious how many of you kind of thought that in your head as you were going through it. This company, Balsa, recently did a survey of the best and worst parts of people's jobs. On the good news, we all like our teammates. I like my teammates too. But most of us are still frustrated with the problems that all of us here in this room are trying to solve, which is that it still takes too long to ship and deploy. So still the same thing, but I think we know one key thing we didn't know 10 years ago. So in 2018, Nicole, Jez, and Jean wrote the book Accelerate, which I think probably most of you have read before, but if you haven't, it's a really great overview. But the thing I love the most in the data they pulled is I think 10 years ago, we really thought there was this trade-off between fast and safe. And today we have the data to tell us there is no trade-off between fast and safe. We actually just have to invest in making both of them better. We have to be able to increase the speed and reduce the risk. I think this must be the least controversial slide of all time. But so what I want to do with the rest of the time we have together is talk about 4 ways we're going to keep doing that in the next 10 years and what all of those together will mean for us. So the first of my 4 themes, I think we're going to see way more real-time feedback loops in every single tool. So what is a real-time feedback loop? If you have kids, you might have seen this before. This is Scratch. It's a project out of lifelong kindergarten at MIT. And you can see that on the left-hand side, you can write little blocks of code, move 10 steps, turn 15 degrees, move another 10 steps, and your little character animates and does your actions on the right-hand side. And so we do this all the time for learning tools. Norbert Weiner was the mathematician at MIT who originally started talking about this concept, but people learn much faster when they see exactly what's happening while they're doing something. We actually talk about this research a lot, again, now with AI. But for this case, we do this for kids. It happens in Scratch. It happens in the logo with the turtle. It happens in Lego Mindstorms. But up until this point, most of our tools as professionals haven't given us that advantage. I think we do think of it as being a little bit childish, and that's going to shift. So one example of this is replay.io. This is what they call a time-traveling debugger. It's from the team that used to be at Mozilla. And you can think of it as a combination of the Chrome DevTools with Full Story, which allows you to watch a video of what a customer is doing. It's usually targeted at marketing people. But here you can see that on the right-hand side, you see the lines being drawn and every third line is white. And as that's happening and you're scrubbing through time, you can see exactly which line is executing while you're in that process. And so you can imagine compared to when you get a ticket from someone in support and you have to go repro it for yourself and then look at it and then debug, you can imagine this joint world where you see exactly what the user was doing and exactly what was executing greatly reduces the time to fix something and deliver that fix out. Similarly, Snaplet, they consider themselves a tool for sitting between the database and the developer for improving the user experience. And so this that I pulled is the idea that you might have some sensitive information that you don't want people to have, and you want to be able to generate mock data that is part of it. In this case, it's just first names. And so you can see that once you have successfully generated a list of first names, they all populate as a table right below the script you've started to write. And so you can imagine taking this further. Maybe you do first names that are in a specific language or match a specific location or have some other interesting attribute that you want to test in the set of test data you're generating. But again, you can see that the interesting thing is you get this immediate reaction as you start to build out the change that you're making. This one's pretty simple, but you can see how this would go to other experiences as well. And then third, for a more infrastructure-y tool, with this one, I'll try to play the video and let the founder talk about it himself. This is Zeplo. It's an API gateway. And you can see here, what you'll hopefully see is that as requests come to the API and they test it, they're able to see and pull out in real time the parameters and what's matching or not.
And that works great. Now let's test our new route.
So you can see up there, he's adding a request to a specific product API.
It also tells us what those tokens were. So I have high confidence I've written the regular expression in my path correctly. Regular expressions can be pretty gnarly, so it is important to test them. So you can do really advanced stuff like wildcard grouped matches, like I'm doing here. So if I break this route now, that's going to be picked up by that wildcard route. And our route tester also tells us, hey, we found a regular expression group. That group is 0 group, and here's the token that it matched. So and
so you can see there isn't much in common between something like Zeplo or Snaplet or Replay or Scratch, other than you start to see this user experience pattern of getting the feedback immediately coming up in more and more tools as we build. And from what we know with education, I think these real-time feedback loops will be one of the trends that most increase our speed when being able to build. And because we'll be checking what we do more often as we build, will also greatly reduce the risk of everything we're adding to our code bases. Secondly, again, probably non-controversial, I think we're going to get a lot more incident infrastructure. If you think about now compared to 10 years ago, the fact that at least I can now deploy 26,000 times faster. We haven't made as much progress on the infrastructure for incidents side. And I specifically say this because when we talk about, and I know we talked about some of this yesterday, I think, from following on Twitter, most of us are still relying on manual processes and people to do a lot of the work. And so what I want to take us through is the life cycle of an incident today and the places where I think we're going to be seeing more and more tooling and changes come up. So first, right now when an incident occurs, we mostly end up going straight from incident to person. I think it is unlikely this keeps continuing. And as we continue to build, we're going to end up with a much smaller percentage of incidents that go to a person. Instead, for anything that today is, and a bunch of you probably have these, you're like, oh, when this thing happens, I go fix this thing and then it's fine. I think all of those incidents are going to completely go away. And anything that has a default runbook will all run before a person becomes in the loop at all. Then, the next step, once a pager goes off, I talked to Paul Nakata. Paul's the founder of ab.bot. He worked on the original chat app stuff at GitHub, and they're now making a platform to make it easier for other people to build chat apps. But then when the pager goes off, we're no longer just going to have a rotation that's based on everyone who signed up for it. We're going to be much smarter about who we're waking up or at least interrupting their dinner based on what's most likely to be going on. I know we've talked about this for a while, but I think this is one of the things that's definitely going to happen over the next 10 years. I'm excited to see who starts building this out. I think there will be systems for this. Maybe it'll be pager duty. I personally think it will make the lives of many of us a lot better. Then when the incident opens, I remember pretty much every time this happened at dark, you would be like, hey, that thing's funny. And someone would mention it in a random channel. It might move over to the engineering channel, and then someone would open a new channel and they would name it with a not standardized name, which might just be early stage disorganization. But I think it's also that when you're in the moment, you're likely to just name it whatever you think it is, maybe by the date or maybe by the system that has a problem. And then you kind of keep going. We're already starting to see tools that build on top of that workflow. So Alma.io is one that is meant to be a system to add structure on top of Slack because that's where they think people are already dealing with the incident responses. Maybe it will stay in Slack. I think it's possible as we move towards more communication platforms. I don't think Slack will reign supreme forever. The one in the bottom is Kumo Space. We'll start to have rooms that are created by default when something happens. The right people are invited. People get redirected to them. And within those spaces, we end up with the charts we would already pull for ourselves manually that are roughly structured in a way that people can examine them. We also are seeing other platforms try to do this. So fiberplane.dev is another one, and they're looking at using a notebook-like interface to do this as a land of communication to be able to put things together. Blameless, I believe, is another one in this same space. And so the collaboration we'll be doing for our incidents will also have more tooling to support it. Then lastly, after incidents resolve, a lot of you probably have the thing on the left. Someone writes a report. Maybe there are some action items. They pile up over time, and no one ever looks at them again, unfortunately. And I think that maybe that makes people feel good that it's been documented. Maybe that helps you resolve the one specific thing, but it doesn't necessarily help you learn and develop the system for the future and understand more about what you don't know. And so from this perspective, tools like Jelly and again like Blameless are starting to look at how do we think about the overall themes within the incident resolution and how do we get those to be things we use throughout the organization instead of just a stack of documents that we're going to use all of our time. I don't think any of these are particularly controversial in terms of where we're going, but I think we underestimate the amount that having better tooling for incidents, the same way we do for deployments, will change. And then in 10 years, we'll kind of look back at now as the idea of being like, oh, manually doing every single step of the process. So this will, to my mind, reduce risk more than anything. If it starts to become nearly free to fix something, you worry a lot less about doing it, and that will increase our speed. Third, I know we were actually just talking about this with Daily Dev. I think developer experience will continue to be key. And since so many people are here, I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework for how we can think about building developer experience into our tools and how this matters. So going back to the first topic and giving people real-time feedback, this is me. I took an actual photo of my computer. This is a super early prototype of what Dark was. And the idea in this was we wanted to show people what code actually evaluated to as it ran. And so you can see the first line is a coded string. And then basically you take a string for each. And the third line, the first character was R, then converted that to the ASCII, then shifted that to get to an actual alphabet, shifted it 13 characters, did the mod because there's only 26 letters in that alphabet, and then shifted it back. And what we learned from doing this, even though it had that benefit of having the real-time feedback loop, the experience was way, way too noisy for people. And so we couldn't get the benefit of this other tool that we'd actually used because it was too much to learn too quickly. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there too that I didn't even touch on that made it feel noisy, like the characters for indexing in, or like what's the concept of a whole, or why is this written in a functional way. And so you can't just add one idea and end up with a good developer experience. The crux of ending up with it is getting someone into a flow state. So flow state is a concept that was pioneered by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was a Czech psychologist. And it's the idea that you always want to be in this channel where your skills and how much you already know corresponds effectively with how hard the thing you're trying to do is. And so I've been working on applying this specifically to developer tooling. And I think there's 6 things that we can do while we're building our tools to help make sure developers stay in flow while they're using our tools. And for all of you who make tools for developers, get people to actually stick, adopt, and then retain them as users of your product. So let's walk through examples of these. So for learning style, there tend to be a few main ways people like to learn things. Some people like to learn from the bottom up. When they're learning a new language, they just write the same function or the same small project as always. And some people like to learn more top down, where they want to see something functional and then deconstruct it. Similarly, some people like to ramp up on a new code base differently. So one thing I think is interesting is there's this tool, Codesy, that came out recently. They built the idea of a map. And so this allows people to say, instead of just kind of going through a GitHub repo, and what I will usually do is look at the top contributors, read some old pull requests, see which parts of the code base are most active. This instead gives you a visual representation of the code base that can be annotated by someone who works on it actively. And so it's not necessarily easier, but for people of a different learning style, it becomes an easier way to ramp up on what they're doing when you hire someone new. And so you always want to be keeping in mind when you're building something and giving it to everyone, you want to test with a few different people for, can you learn this the way I built it? Because there will be those primary differences, and each of us has our own and then tends to build for our own, which doesn't end up working out in the long run. Next one. You don't want things to be too hard for people to adopt. Things that tend to make people feel more comfortable are things that build on something they already have. So it feels common to an experience they already have. Like we were talking about earlier with Alma layering into Slack as incident response. That's a good example of that. You're not asking people to go open a different web page and do something. They're just working on it. Or similarly, this is a tool, Optic. Optic is meant to help people review differences in API changes, particularly for internal partner teams. And they built a lot of it by relying on a similar idea of how people do code review today, being able to say, this was added, this was deleted, this has changed. And so most developers who pick up Optic end up feeling like it feels a lot like GitHub and what they've already done. Similarly, they've also built it so there's an open source version and a cloud-hosted version. So if the developer is familiar, like whatever they prefer as part of their workflow, it becomes easier for them to adopt in that way. And so the key of not too hard is just making it so someone feels like they're layering onto those skills they already have, rather than like full cold start problem. Equally challenging is not too easy. Another dark example, like you saw in the GIF at the beginning, we just made the API. You also just made a data store by saying plus data store, and it just appeared like this out of nowhere. And the number of conversations I had with people where they were like, nope, it can't be a data store. That was too easy. I need to type things. I need to do stuff. Taught me that there is a such thing as too easy. And that makes sense if you think about your own experience of being a developer. I think a lot of us probably had that experience where the first script we wrote was we had to do a manual task, and we're like, well, it'll take me 40 minutes to do this task manually, and then we spent 2 hours learning how to write a script to automate it because we didn't want to deal with it. And so it's that same experience for new tooling. In contrast, the dark one, Railway, which is another infrastructure provisioning tool, does a similar thing, but it lets you wait for a little bit, even though it doesn't take that long. And people tend to end up feeling like this is a better experience. This is also actually, it's true of consumer tooling. So if you've ever used, it's a little out of date now, but Kayak, and they have the little flippy thing that says which airline they're searching for a flight on. That doesn't actually do anything, but it got people to book flights much more often, because what would happen was it made them feel like the computer was doing what they would do and go to every single website. And so you want to end up having that mirrored experience rather than it just being a completely magic thing, whether you have consumers or developers. Progressive disclosure is one of my favorite concepts from classic user experience design. This is the chart from the Nielsen website about it, but it's basically just the idea of like, give me the important thing first and let me get to the next thing next. And so rather than just progressing through something linearly, showing things at the right moment. This is really important, I think, for all of us to keep in mind, is most developers especially, and we'll get to customization, invest in their tools. We want to give everyone every possible option. And when we do that, we end up creating something that's too cluttered for someone to be able to gradually learn over time. Docs and error messages, I feel like, are pretty self-explanatory and canon, but when you're thinking about building something and adding it for developers, the doxer is much a part of the product as the product is itself. These are the retool docs. I think they're quite good because they have a lot of screenshots. They make it very easy to figure out what exactly you're building and where you debug. I'll also link to an article at the end that talks about 9 of the elements of great documentation. But don't underestimate this when thinking about building tools. And then lastly, I like to think of it as customization as expert mode. If you really want to evaluate if the tool you've built is working for a developer, see if they've started to customize it to their workflow. Because at that point, they've invested, or you in your own tools, have invested time and energy and effort to make it work specifically for you, which ends up being a nice sticky barrier toward, like, from switching to something else. I know none of us like the idea of vendor lock-in, and so this is a way to create a sense of lock-in, but it comes from the emotional side rather than from some actual you can't switch side. A great example of this is terminals. I really enjoy seeing how everyone sets it up. Editors are another good one. And so like if you wonder why people end up being such Vim, and some of you probably are, Vim or Emacs loyalists, it's usually that you've invested so much time over such a long span of time that you're almost never going to end up back at the same place with something else. And that means you won't switch. And so I think tools that really focus on building this well are going to help developers move faster because they'll learn them faster and they'll stay in this flow channel rather than getting distracted or churning. And having those experiences, I mean, it's a little bit more tenuous, but I think when you're invested in what you're building and you've stayed and not gotten distracted, that'll help reduce the risk of the things as well. So the last one. I think we're all going to move towards talking in business metrics instead of our classic infrastructure ones. So when I say the classic infrastructure ones, these come from Accelerate. I know all of us have slight variations on them, but the idea we have these 2 metrics around the speed at which we're able to ship software, our deployment frequency, and our lead time for changes, and 2 around risk, the change failure rate, and the mean time to restore. So even less popular than telling people I want to get rid of ops, I also, at one point in my life, went and did an MBA. And from being in that classroom, I can tell you that all 4 of these are completely meaningless to almost every business executive I have ever met. And the investment you would need to make to teach them over time, I know they seem really approachable when we all work in these spaces all day. They're not. You can kind of get there if you start explaining that like GitHub is like track changes for Word, and then you're like deploying as if you imagine emailing files around, and it gets really tenuous. And so I think we're much better off learning to translate what we're doing. There is actually one infrastructure case that I like to mention that they wrote about Cloudflare. It's a good read, mostly because Cloudflare got into a situation where the pager was going off every 20 minutes. But even within this case, business executives focused more on, are people going to quit, not why is the pager going off every 20 minutes, and how do we build infrastructure to fix that? And so you also see this. This is Sequoia's template for what they want an early stage company to talk about at a board meeting, but it's pretty much always big picture, financial metrics, team, what products are we shipping next? It's never about how well is our infrastructure performing. Perhaps if you're actually an infrastructure company, but otherwise the types of things we're talking about, to be able to get the buy-in to make the investments we want to make, we need to tie them back to what executives are already talking about. The three I think are probably most obvious are if you can tie it to we're having this type of incident because we are not investing in this system and we are literally lighting money on fire every time it goes down. That tends to be pretty compelling. The second one is the idea of we always need to be closing new sales. And if you can draw a direct link between a market that you'll be able to get into, if you're able to ship faster, if you have a better set of infrastructure tooling, that can also be convincing. And finally, time pressure is always good. So if you can find some way to tie the investment you want to make to an immediate short-term OKR that someone else is looking at, that helps too. So for instance, if you know your company is having a big issue with customer support tickets and wanting them to get better, then you might be able to say, okay, if we reduce our lead time to change, we'll be able to respond to these customers more quickly. But I think we'll get a lot more buy-in tying to these. If for some reason you can't connect to one of these, I would recommend going to every executive team and board's favorite topic right now, which is how hard it is to hire people. And so if you can't tie to a specific business metric, I would instead tie to either the happiness of your team for some sort of internal NPS rating, or your ability to get employee referrals because they're willing to suggest their friends work at your company, or something like more subjective and tied to the team development. And so communicating in business metrics, while it's not necessarily going to directly make you go faster today, and it's not necessarily going to de-risk things, I think it's the only way we're going to continue to get high-level support for being able to continue to invest in this over time and get the systems we need to go faster and reduce risk. And so that's where I want to leave us for a second. If we were able to get full organizational buy-in for the importance of the work we're doing in ops and DevOps, if we were able to get tools that were designed for both flow and developer experience, if we're able to get real-time feedback every time something goes wrong, and when something goes wrong, our incidences are managed as well as our deploys are today, what do you think would happen? I have a few hypotheses, but I'd be interested in talking to any of you about yours. I'll be around all day. Come find me. So I think we'll have much smoother cross-team collaboration. We'll have more info resources to be able to do the work we want to do. I think our work will be more fun. I think the speed at which we're able to deploy will go towards infinity. If you take my 26,000 number again and assume we can get that much better given 10 more years, we would be able to deploy 7.3 times per second, which seems pretty close to infinity to me. Our risk will go way down because we'll have fewer incidents, and the ones we have will have more data and be able to resolve more quickly. Going back to the part at the beginning, when you start to think about speed going towards infinity, there's a concept people have been talking about recently called self-provisioning runtimes. It's akin to Dark, but without necessarily having to build in the language. I think we'll start getting there. I think once you assume it becomes easier to on-ramp onto a tool and you get feedback as you're doing it, you start getting to the point where everyone can start to write software, which is personally very motivating to me. And it means we're going to need a much bigger room for this conference, even though this one's pretty good. And I think we're going to build a lot more interesting and valuable companies. So I promised I would pull this up at the end. I know a lot of that is pretty high level. I hope it's motivational for where we might be going. And I hope you also saw at least one thing in the very many set of tools that might be helpful to your organization today. And so with that, thank you for having me here. I'm so glad I finally got here.